there, Grandma!
What are you talking about? That's impossible.
Betty Poole checked the oven clock for the third time in 5 minutes. It was 6:14 p.m. The pot roast had been resting on the counter for 20 minutes, the savory smell of onions and carrots filling the kitchen, but the driveway remained empty. Joe was never late. In 45 years of marriage, Joseph Poole had been a creature of absolute habit. If he said he would be home from his business trip by 6 o'clock, his car usually pulled into the garage at 5:55. He was the kind of man who set his watch by the radio news and kept a spare key for everything. Reliability was his currency. Betty wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the front window. She pulled back the sheer curtain just an inch. The street was quiet. The suburban neighborhood, where they had lived for 30 years, was settling down for the evening. A neighbor was walking a dog. A delivery truck rumbled in the distance, but there was no sign of Joe's silver sedan. She felt a small, nagging knot form in her stomach. It wasn't panic yet, just a low-level hum of anxiety. They were supposed to finalize the plans for their anniversary trip tonight. 45 years. The sapphire anniversary. They had talked about taking a cruise down the Danube, or maybe just a quiet week in Savannah. Joe had been working so hard lately, harder than a man of 70 should work, and Betty was ready for him to finally slow down. They were supposed to be in their golden years. This was supposed to be the time for rest. She went back to the kitchen and picked up her cell phone. She dialed his number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. "Hi, this is Joe. Leave a message." His voice sounded so normal, so sturdy. "Joe, it's me," Betty said, trying to keep her voice light. "Dinner is ready. The roast is going to get cold. Call me when you get this." She hung up and sat at the small kitchen table. The silence in the house felt heavier than usual. She looked around at the life they had built. The oak cabinets they had installed 10 years ago, the collection of ceramic plates on the wall, the calendar marked with doctor's appointments and church socials. It was a good life, a safe life. Then she saw the lights. They weren't the soft yellow beams of Joe's headlights sweeping across the wall. These were flashing, blue and red, harsh, rhythmic, and terrifying. Betty stood up, her knees making a popping sound. She walked to the front door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't want to open it. She knew, with a terrible instinct that every wife possesses, that if she kept the door closed, the world would stay the same. If she opened it, everything would change. The doorbell rang. It wasn't a friendly chime. It sounded like a judgment. Betty unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. 2 police officers stood on her welcome mat. They looked painfully young. One of them, a tall man with a somber face, took off his hat. "Mrs. Poole? Mrs. Joseph Poole?" he asked. "Yes," Betty whispered. She couldn't find her breath. "May we come inside, ma'am?" Betty stepped back. She felt like she was moving underwater. She led them into the living room, but she didn't sit down. She couldn't sit. If she sat down, it would be real. "Mrs. Poole," the officer said gently, "I am very sorry to tell you this. There has been an accident." The word hung in the air. Accident. Is he hurt? Betty asked. Her voice sounded strange, high and thin, like a child's. "Which hospital is he in? I need to get my purse." The officers exchanged a look. It was a look of pity that stopped Betty cold. "He isn't in the hospital, ma'am," the officer said. "It happened out on Route 9, near the Old Gorge. It appears your husband's vehicle lost control on a curve. It went over the guardrail and into the ravine." Betty shook her head. "Joe is a good driver. He's very careful. We believe he may have fallen asleep at the wheel or perhaps swerved to avoid something. The drop was significant, Mrs. Poole. The vehicle caught fire upon impact." Betty stared at the officer's shiny badge. The fire, the ravine. He's gone, she asked. We are very sorry. The officer reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, clear plastic bag. Inside, blackened by soot but unmistakable, was a thick gold band. We found this at the scene, the officer said softly. We haven't been able to formally identify the remains yet because of the nature of the fire. But the car is registered to Joseph Poole, and we found this wedding band near the driver's side. Betty reached out and took the bag. She didn't look at the ring. She just held it tight in her fist, the metal digging into her palm. It was the ring she had placed on his finger 45 years ago in a small church in Ohio. There was nothing else? She asked. No, ma'am. The fire was very intense. It consumed almost everything. The world didn't spin. It didn't go black. Instead, everything became incredibly sharp. Betty noticed a dust bunny under the recliner. She heard the refrigerator compressor kick on in the kitchen. She felt the cold draft coming from the hallway. Joe was dead. He wasn't coming home for the pot roast. There would be no trip to Savannah. The golden years had just evaporated in a burst of flames on Route 9. The next few hours were a blur of noise and strangers. The officers asked if there was anyone they could call. Betty didn't have children. It had been their one great sorrow, but they had made peace with it. She called her sister, Margie, who lived 3 towns over. Margie screamed when she heard the news. Betty didn't scream. She couldn't. She felt hollowed out like a pumpkin scraped clean. By midnight, the house was full of people. Neighbors, Margie, the pastor. They brought casseroles and spoke in hushed, reverent tones. They touched her shoulder and said, "He didn't suffer, and he's in a better place." Betty sat in Joe's recliner, clutching a tissue that had shredded in her damp hand. She felt like an actor in a play she hadn't rehearsed for. She nodded when she was supposed to nod. She drank the tea they put in her hands. 2 days later, she sat in the funeral director's office. The room smelled of lilies and floor wax. Regarding the service, Mrs. Poole, the director said, his voice smooth like oil. Given the circumstances of the accident and the condition of the remains, we strongly recommend a closed casket. It would be best to remember Joseph as he was. Betty looked at him. She wanted to say she needed to see him. She needed to know it was really him. How could she say goodbye to a box? But the image of the fire, the ravine, the burnt car, it terrified her. She was 68 years old. She didn't want her last memory of the man she loved to be a nightmare. "Okay," Betty said. "Closed casket. We can place a framed photo on top," the director suggested. "A nice one, maybe from the wedding." "No," Betty said, "from last Christmas. He looked happy then. The funeral was on a Tuesday. It didn't rain. The sun was shining, which felt cruel. The sky was a brilliant, cheerful blue." Betty wore the black dress she had bought for her mother's funeral 5 years ago. It felt loose around her waist. She hadn't eaten since the police knocked on her door. She sat in the front row, staring at the mahogany casket. It looked so heavy, so final. The pastor spoke about Joe's dedication to the community, his reliability, his quiet strength. People nodded. Betty tried to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. The doctor had given her a sedative to help her sleep, and it made the daylight feel fuzzy. She kept looking at the casket, waiting for him to sit up, waiting for him to say it was a mistake, that he had just taken a wrong turn. But the casket stayed shut. After the service, the guests came back to the house for coffee and sandwiches. They filled her living room with chatter. They talked about the weather, about the local football team, about property taxes. Life was marching on for everyone else. "You're a strong woman, Betty," her neighbor Susan said, patting her hand. "You'll get through this. You have the insurance money, right?" Joe always took care of things. Yes, Betty said vaguely. Joe took care of things. By 8 p.m., everyone was gone. Betty locked the front door. The click of the deadbolt echoed through the house. She walked into the kitchen. The pot roast from the night he died was still in the trash can, wrapped in foil. The house smelled of stale coffee and floral arrangements. She walked down the hallway to their bedroom. His pajamas were still under his pillow. His hairbrush was on the dresser, a few strands of gray hair caught in the bristles. Betty sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at the nightstand. The life insurance policy was in the safe deposit box. Joe had told her that 100 times. If anything happens to me, Betty, you go to the bank. You'll be safe. The house is paid for. She picked up the framed photo of them from their 40th anniversary. They were smiling, sunburned, and holding hands. You left me, Joe, she whispered to the empty room. We were supposed to do this together. She turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. She lay down on her side of the bed, leaving his side empty. She reached out and touched the cold sheet where he should have been. She was a widow. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. She closed her eyes, praying for sleep, unaware that the man she was mourning was the only reason she would soon be fighting for her life. The silence of the house wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. The calendar on the kitchen wall was turned to November. A big red circle was drawn around the 22nd. Betty didn't need the circle to remember what day it was. Her body knew. From the moment she woke up that morning, her chest felt tight, the same way it had felt when the police officer stood on her porch exactly 365 days ago. It had been a year of firsts, the grief books called it. The first Christmas alone, the first birthday alone, the first time the furnace made a funny noise, and she had to call a repairman herself because Joe wasn't there to tinker with it. She had survived them all, one by one, ticking them off like chores on a list she never wanted to write. Betty stood at the kitchen counter, buttering a single slice of toast. The silence in the house was different now. In the beginning, right after the funeral, the silence was loud and screaming. Now it was just a roommate. It was a dull, heavy presence that sat in the chair opposite her. She looked at the stack of mail on the table. There was a bank statement. She opened it. The numbers were black and positive. The life insurance money, $500,000, sat in her savings account. It had paid off the mortgage. It paid the property taxes. It paid for the new roof the house needed last spring. Technically, Betty was secure. She was the kind of widow people called lucky behind her back because she wasn't struggling to buy groceries. But every time she looked at that bank balance, she felt a wave of nausea. It felt like blood money. It was a trade. The universe had taken Joe and given her a check in return. She would have given every single penny back. She would have lived in a cardboard box if it meant Joe could walk through the back door and complain about the neighbors one more time. Happy anniversary, Joe, she whispered to the empty room. She finished her toast, though it tasted like cardboard. Today was the day she had to go visit him. She went every Sunday, usually, but today was different. Today she had to bring the special flowers. She went to the hall closet and put on her coat. It was a crisp autumn afternoon. The sun was already starting its slow descent, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn. Betty grabbed her keys and the bouquet of yellow roses she had bought from the florist in town. Yellow for friendship, for loyalty. The drive to the cemetery took 20 minutes. Betty drove slowly. She was a careful driver now, terrified of accidents. Every curve in the road reminded her of the ravine, of the fire. She still hadn't driven past the spot on Route 9 where it happened. She took the long way around, adding 5 miles to every trip just to avoid the ghosts. She pulled through the wrought iron gates of the restful Valley Cemetery. It was a quiet place, tucked away behind a line of thick oak trees. It was older peaceful, the kind of place Joe would have approved of. He liked quiet. He liked order. Betty parked the car on the gravel path. There were only 2 other cars in the distance. It was late in the day, and most visitors had already come and gone. The groundskeeper's truck was parked near the shed, but she didn't see Victor. He was probably packing up for the day. She stepped out of the car. The air smelled of dry leaves and damp earth. She clutched the roses to her chest and began the walk toward the family plot. Joe's grave was near the back, under a large maple tree. He had picked the spot himself years ago. Ideally situated, he had joked, "Great view of the squirrels." As Betty rounded the bend in the path, she stopped. She squinted, her eyes adjusting to the dappled sunlight filtering through the branches. Someone was there. Usually, the cemetery was empty this late, but right there, sitting directly on top of the fresh grass of Joe's grave, was a figure. It wasn't a mourner. It was too small. It was a child. Betty walked faster, a sudden flash of irritation spiking through her grief. It was hallowed ground. It wasn't a playground. She saw it was a little girl, maybe 7 years old, with messy pigtails and a bright pink coat that looked a size too small. She was sitting cross-legged right on the center of the plot, humming a tune to herself. She had a plastic doll in her hand and was marching it up and down the granite headstone like it was a mountain. "Excuse me," Betty called out, her voice sharp. The little girl stopped humming. She turned her head. She had big, wide eyes and a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She didn't look scared. She looked curious. Betty reached the edge of the grave. She felt protective, like someone had broken into her home. This was the only place she had left with Joe. It was their private space. "Honey, you shouldn't be sitting there," Betty said, trying to soften her tone, but failing. "That's not a bench. That's a grave. It's where people are sleeping." The girl looked down at the grass, then back up at Betty. She didn't move. She just stared at Betty with an intensity that made Betty feel uncomfortable. "Are you lost?" Betty asked. "Where are your parents? The cemetery is closing soon." The girl shrugged. "My dad is working. He's over there." She pointed vaguely toward the maintenance shed. Betty realized this must be Victor's daughter. She had seen Victor around, a quiet, nervous man who kept his head down, but she didn't know he had a child this young. "Well, you need to go find him," Betty said, stepping closer. "I'm here to visit my husband. This is his grave, and it's not respectful to play on top of him." Betty realized she sounded like a scolding schoolteacher, but she couldn't help it. Her nerves were raw. The anniversary had left her skin thin. She just wanted 5 minutes of peace to talk to Joe, to tell him she missed him, to cry without anyone watching. The girl stood up slowly. She brushed the grass off her leggings. She looked at the headstone, reading the name. Joseph Poole, beloved husband. "That's right," Betty said, her voice trembling slightly. "Joseph, he was a very good man, and he's resting right there, so we need to be quiet and respectful." The girl tilted her head. She looked at Betty with an expression that seemed too old for her face. It wasn't rudeness. It was pity. It was a strange, knowing look that sent a cold shiver down Betty's spine, colder than the autumn wind. "You think he's sleeping?" the girl asked. "He is resting in peace, yes," Betty said, clutching the yellow roses tighter. A thorn digging into her thumb. "He passed away a year ago today." The girl looked at the ground, specifically at the patch of earth she had just been sitting on. She kicked the dirt lightly with the toe of her sneaker. "You're wrong, lady," the girl said. Her voice was matter-of-fact, clear as a bell in the quiet cemetery. Betty blinked. "Excuse me?" The girl looked up, locking eyes with Betty. She hugged her plastic doll to her chest. "It's okay," the girl said, her voice dropping to a loud whisper, as if she were sharing a secret on a playground. "You don't have to be sad at this spot. My daddy says nobody is sleeping in this box anyway. The words hung in the cool autumn air like smoke. Nobody is sleeping in this box anyway. Betty felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She looked at the little girl, Emily. The child wasn't smiling. She wasn't laughing or trying to be mean. She was just stating a fact, the way a child might say the sky is blue or grass is green. "What did you say?" Betty asked, her voice barely a whisper. She took a step closer, her grip on the yellow roses tightening until the stems snapped. Emily looked down at her plastic doll, suddenly shy. She scuffed her sneaker against the granite base of the headstone. "Nothing. I didn't say nothing. You said the box is empty." Betty pressed, her heart starting to pound a strange, uneven rhythm against her ribs. "Why would you say that, sweetie? Who told you that?" Before the girl could answer, a heavy boot crunched on the gravel path behind them. "Emily, get away from there." Betty spun around. Victor, the groundskeeper, was jogging toward them. He was a man in his 50s, usually slow-moving and quiet, always wearing a stained gray jumpsuit. But today, he was moving with a frantic energy that didn't fit him. His face was pale, and sweat was beading on his forehead despite the chill in the air. He reached them and grabbed Emily by the arm. A little too roughly, Betty thought. He pulled the girl behind him, shielding her as if Betty were a threat. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Poole," Victor stammered. He wouldn't look Betty in the eye. He kept his gaze fixed on the headstone, then on his boots. "She knows she's not allowed near the plots. I told her 100 times. Kids, you know, they wander off." Betty ignored the apology. She was staring at Victor's hands. They were shaking. Why was he shaking? "Victor," Betty said, keeping her voice steady, "your daughter just said something very strange to me." Victor let out a harsh, nervous laugh. It sounded like a bark. "Oh, don't listen to her, Mrs. Poole. She's got an imagination on her. This one, always telling stories. Last week she told me she saw a dinosaur in the tool shed. Crazy stuff." He gave Emily a little shake. "Tell Mrs. Poole you were making up stories, The little girl looked up at her father. Her eyes went wide with fear. She didn't look like a child who had been caught playing a game. She looked like a child who had been caught telling a secret. I made it up," Emily whispered, staring at her shoes. "See," Victor said, a little too loud. "Just a game. We're going now. We gotta lock up the gates. You should head home, Mrs. Poole. Getting dark." He didn't wait for Betty to answer. He turned and practically marched his daughter back toward the maintenance shed. Betty watched them go. She saw Emily look back over her shoulder once, her eyes sad and confused, before Victor pulled her around the corner of the building. Betty stood alone at the grave. The silence rushed back in, but it didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt heavy. She looked down at the grass covering Joe. "Nobody is sleeping in this box." "That's ridiculous," Betty said out loud. She forced herself to kneel and place the yellow roses against the stone. "It's just a child's story. Joe is here. I saw the ring. The police said so." But as she walked back to her car, her legs felt like lead. She couldn't shake the image of Victor's face. He hadn't looked annoyed. He had looked terrified. The drive home was a blur. Betty drove on autopilot, her mind replaying the scene over and over. Why did Victor panic? If Emily had just said something silly, a normal father would have laughed it off. "Sorry, ma'am. Kids say the darndest things." But Victor had acted like he was covering up a crime scene. When she got home, the house was dark. She unlocked the door and stepped into the foyer. Usually, this was the time of day she felt the loneliness the most. But tonight, there was no room for loneliness. Her mind was too crowded with questions. She heated up a bowl of soup for dinner, but couldn't eat it. She sat at the kitchen table, stirring the spoon until the broth went cold. I know my husband, she thought, and I know when people are lying. Betty had been a teacher for 30 years before she retired. She knew what a lying child looked like. Emily hadn't been lying when she spoke about the grave. She had been lying when she apologized. Betty pushed the bowl away. She needed to stop this. She was letting a child's comment drive her crazy. She needed proof that she was being irrational. She needed to ground herself in the facts. She stood up and walked into the living room. She went to the closet under the stairs. On the top shelf, tucked behind the winter blankets, was a metal tin, the keepsake box. After the funeral, the police had given her a plastic bag containing the few items they had recovered from the crash site. Items that had been thrown clear of the fire. Betty had put them in this tin and hadn't opened it since. It was too painful. But tonight, pain was better than this gnawing doubt. She carried the tin to the coffee table and sat down. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, it smelled faintly of smoke and old leather. There was Joe's wallet, scorched on one side, but still intact. There was his watch, the glass face cracked, the hands frozen at 6:04. There was a keychain with the keys melted together. Betty picked up the wallet. The leather was stiff and blackened at the edges. She opened it. Joe's driver's license was inside. The plastic bubbled from the heat. A few credit cards, warped and useless, and tucked in the back flap, where Joe always kept his receipts for expense reports, was a folded piece of paper. It was miraculous it hadn't burned. It must have been shielded by the thick leather of the wallet. Betty unfolded it carefully. The thermal paper was yellowed and brittle, but the ink was still legible. It was a receipt from a gas station, Pete's Stop and Go, located on the other side of the county, about 40 miles from where the accident happened. Betty adjusted her glasses. She looked at the date. November 22nd, the day he died. She looked at the time stamp printed at the bottom. 8:15 p.m. Betty stopped breathing. She stared at the numbers until they blurred. 8:15 p.m. She closed her eyes and counted to 10, then opened them again. The numbers didn't change. Her mind raced back to that night. The police had knocked on her door at 7:30 p.m. She remembered the clock on the oven. 6:14 p.m. when she checked the roast. The police arrived a little over an hour later. They told her the accident had happened around 6 p.m. They said he died instantly. If Joe died at 6 p.m. and the police were at her house at 7:30 p.m., how did Joe buy $20 of unleaded gas and a pack of gum at 8:15 p.m.? Betty's hands started to shake uncontrollably. She dropped the receipt on the table as if it were burning her fingers. It wasn't possible. It had to be a mistake. Maybe the gas station's machine was broken. Maybe the time was set wrong. But Joe was meticulous. He checked his receipts. If the time was wrong, he would have noted it. She picked up the receipt again. She looked at the items purchased. Gas, gum, and 2 bottles of water. 2 bottles. Joe never drank bottled water. He carried a thermos. He said paying for water was a scam. Betty stood up, her knees weak. She paced the room. The silence of the house was screaming at her now. The little girl at the grave. Nobody is sleeping in this box. Victor's terror. The closed casket. The quick cremation recommendation she had almost agreed to before deciding on a burial. A horrible, impossible picture was starting to form in her mind. It was a puzzle she didn't want to solve, but the pieces were clicking together with a terrifying snap. "You didn't die at 6 o'clock," Betty whispered, her voice trembling in the empty room. She looked at the receipt again. The gas station was 40 miles away from the crash site, in the opposite direction of home. If the police were right, Joe was dead in a ravine. If this receipt was right, Joe, or someone carrying his wallet, was alive and driving away from the accident 2 hours after it happened. Betty felt a wave of nausea, but beneath it, something else was rising. It was anger. It was the fierce, protective instinct of a woman who realizes she has been played. She wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. She was a witness to a lie. She grabbed her phone. She needed to know if that gas station had cameras. She needed to know who was using her husband's credit card 2 hours after his funeral pyre had been lit. Betty Poole wasn't going to sleep tonight. And if her gut was right, neither was Victor. The morning sun hit the kitchen table, illuminating the crumpled gas station receipt like a spotlight on a piece of evidence. Betty hadn't slept. Her eyes felt gritty, as if someone had thrown sand in them, and her coffee had gone cold hours ago. She had spent the night staring at that time stamp. 8:15 p.m. It was a ghost story told in numbers. But Betty wasn't a woman who believed in ghosts. She believed in paperwork. If Joe had been at a gas station 2 hours after he supposedly died, he had to have been driving a car. And if he was driving a car, he had to be going somewhere. She stood up, her joints stiff from sitting in the wooden chair, all night. She needed more. One receipt wasn't enough to overturn a funeral. She needed to find the rest of the trail. She walked into the bedroom. The closet door was closed. She hadn't opened it much in the last year. Inside, Joe's clothes were still hanging there, preserved in a row like a museum exhibit. His blue Sunday suit, his beige windbreaker, the heavy wool coat he wore when it snowed. Betty reached for the wool coat. It was heavy, smelling faintly of mothballs and the peppermint candies Joe always kept in his pockets. She had almost donated these clothes to the Salvation Army last month. She shivered at the thought. If she had given them away, the truth would have gone with them. She plunged her hands into the deep pockets of the coat. In the left pocket, she found a dried-up tissue and a few loose pennies. She moved to the right pocket. Her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. She pulled it out. It was a small silver key. It wasn't a house key or a car key. It was small, square-headed, with a number stamped into the metal. B42. There was something else in the pocket, tucked deep into the lining where the fabric had torn. A folded piece of yellow carbon paper. Betty unfolded it. It was a rental agreement for You Store It, a self-storage facility on the industrial side of town. The date on the agreement was from 3 years ago. The tenant's name was listed as J. Poole, and there, circled in red pen, was the payment method: cash only, paid in full, annually. Betty stared at the paper. Joe didn't have a storage unit. They had a basement, an attic, and a 2-car garage. Why on earth would he need a storage unit across town? And why pay cash? Joe loved his credit card points. He used his card for a pack of gum, just to get the miles. Cash meant no paper trail. Cash meant secrets. Betty didn't bother to change out of her house sweater. She grabbed her purse and the silver key. The drive to the storage facility took 30 minutes. It was in a part of town Betty rarely visited, a landscape of auto body shops, chain-link fences, and cracked pavement. The You Store It facility looked like a fortress made of gray corrugated metal. She punched the gate code listed on the rental agreement into the keypad. The gate rattled open with a screech of rusted metal. Betty drove slowly down the rows of identical orange doors. B40, B41, B42. She parked the car and stepped out. The wind whipped her hair across her face. It was desolate here. No one was around except a stray cat watching her from under a dumpster. She walked up to door B42. A heavy padlock hung on the latch. Betty's hand trembled as she slid the small silver key into the lock. She held her breath. Click! The lock popped open. Betty pulled the latch and heaved the roll-up door upward. It rumbled loudly, echoing off the metal buildings. Sunlight flooded into the dark space, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She expected to see, she didn't know what, maybe stolen goods, another woman's things, but the unit was almost empty. In the center of the concrete floor sat a solitary metal filing cabinet and 3 cardboard boxes stacked on top of each other. That was it. No furniture, no old clothes. Just an office that didn't exist. Betty walked in. The air inside was stale and cold. She approached the filing cabinet. It was unlocked. She pulled open the top drawer. It was full of envelopes. Hundreds of them. Some were unopened. Some had been ripped apart in haste. Betty picked up a handful. They weren't love letters. They were window envelopes. The kind bills come in. She pulled out a letter from a company called Ace Cash Advance. Final notice. It shouted in red ink. Payment overdue. She picked up another. Golden Horseshoe Casino. Line of credit default. And another. A handwritten note on plain paper. No letterhead. Mr. Poole, we have been patient. The interest is compounding. You know what happens next. We know where your wife shops. Betty gasped and dropped the note. She felt like she had been punched in the stomach. We know where your wife shops. She sank down onto one of the cardboard boxes. Her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. She opened the box she was sitting on. It was filled with losing lottery tickets. Thousands of dollars worth of scratch-offs, crumpled into balls. She opened the next box. It was bank statements from an account she didn't know existed. She traced the columns with her finger. Withdrawals. $500. $1,000. $3,000. All withdrawn at ATMs near the racetrack or the casino downtown. She did the math in her head, the numbers tumbling over each other. The dates went back 5 years. 5 years ago, Joe had said the stock market took a dip, and that's why their retirement fund looked a little lower. 4 years ago, he said the roof repair cost double what the quote was. 2 years ago, he said he lost his wallet with $500 cash in it. Lies. It was all lies. Betty looked at the bottom line of the most recent debt consolidation letter, dated just a week before he died. Total outstanding balance, $485,000. Immediate payment required to avoid asset seizure. Betty sat frozen in the dusty silence of the storage unit. The number burned into her brain. $485,000. She thought about the life insurance check she had deposited a year ago, the policy Joe had insisted on increasing right around the time these debts started piling up. The payout had been $500,000. She had used it to pay off the mortgage. She had used it to secure her future. Suddenly, the pieces of the puzzle slammed together with violent force. The debt was going to take the house. They were going to lose everything. The bank, the loan sharks, the casinos, they were coming for the home Betty had polished and cleaned and loved for 40 years. Joe couldn't pay it back. He had dug a hole so deep he couldn't climb out. But he was worth more dead than alive. If he died, the insurance paid out. The house was saved. The sharks got paid, or gave up. Betty would be safe. Tears pricked Betty's eyes, but they weren't the soft tears of mourning. They were hot, angry tears. "You coward," she whispered. He hadn't died of a heart attack. He hadn't died in a tragic accident. He had staged an exit. He had crashed his car, faked his death, and let her bury an empty box so that the insurance company would cut a check to clean up his mess. She looked around the bleak metal room. This was his legacy, not the loving marriage, not the community service awards. This, a cold room full of bad bets and threats, but the receipt from Pete's stop and go meant he hadn't just killed himself to save her. If he had committed suicide, that would be tragic. It would be a twisted kind of love. But he got gas 2 hours later. He bought water. He didn't kill himself. He ran away. He left her to mourn a husband who didn't exist while he drove off into the sunset, free of his debts, leaving her to live on the proceeds of a fraud. Betty stood up. She brushed the dust off her coat. The confusion that had clouded her mind for the last 24 hours was gone. In its place was a cold, hard clarity. Joe was alive. He had played her for a fool. He had made her cry over an empty casket while he was probably drinking a beer somewhere, thinking he was a hero for saving her. She looked at the threatening note again. "We know where your wife shops." "Well," Betty said to the empty room, her voice steady and dangerous, "I know where you kept your secrets, Joe." She grabbed the handwritten threat and the most damning bank statements. She stuffed them into her purse. She wasn't going home to cry. She was going back to the cemetery. Victor knew. Victor had helped him. And Victor was going to tell her exactly where her husband had gone, or she was going to burn his world down, just like Joe had burned that car. Betty Poole walked out of the storage unit and slammed the metal door shut. The echo sounded like a gunshot. Betty drove back to the cemetery with a lead foot. The speed limit signs were just a suggestion now. The sadness that had weighed her down for a year, the heavy blanket of grief that made getting out of bed feel like lifting a boulder, was gone. In its place was a fire that burned hot and clean in her chest. She wasn't driving to a resting place. She was driving to a crime scene. The sun was just starting to dip below the tree line when she pulled through the iron gates of Restful Valley. The shadows were long and stretched across the grass like dark fingers. The closed sign was already hanging on the main office door, but Betty didn't care about hours of operation. She cared about answers. She drove past the rows of silent headstones, past the angel statues and the granite markers, straight to the back of the property. She pulled her car right up to the maintenance shed, kicking up a cloud of gravel dust. The shed was a large, corrugated metal building where they kept the lawnmowers and the backhoe. The large bay door was half open. Inside, she could hear the clanking of metal on metal. Betty stepped out of her car. She didn't bring flowers this time. She brought her purse, heavy with the bank statements and the threatening letter she had found in the storage unit. She slammed her car door shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet evening. She walked into the shed. The air inside smelled of gasoline, cut grass, and stale cigarette smoke. Victor was bent over a workbench, scrubbing a spark plug with a rag. He jumped when he saw Betty standing in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the dying light. "Mrs. Poole." Victor dropped the rag. His eyes darted to the door, then back to her. He wiped his greasy hands on his jumpsuit, looking like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar. We're closed, ma'am. Gates lock in 10 minutes. You shouldn't be back here." "Cut the crap, Victor," Betty said. Her voice was steady, low, and dangerous. She had surprised herself. She hadn't spoken to a man like that in 40 years. But then again, she had never been conned like this before. Victor took a step back, bumping into the workbench. "Excuse me?" Betty walked forward, entering his space. She wasn't a tall woman, but in that moment she felt 10 feet tall. She reached into her purse and pulled out the crumpled gas station receipt and the letter from the loan shark. She slammed them down on the greasy workbench right next to the spark plug. "I went to the storage unit, Victor," she said. "I saw the debts. I saw the gambling losses. And I saw the receipt from the night Joe died. He bought gas 2 hours after the police told me he was dead." Victor stared at the papers, but he didn't read them. He didn't have to. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly shade of gray. "I don't know what you're talking about," Victor stammered, his eyes shifting toward the exit. "I just dig the holes, Mrs. Poole. I don't know nothing about gas receipts." "You're lying," Betty snapped. "Your daughter didn't lie. Emily told me the truth. She said the box is empty." She said you told her nobody was sleeping in it. She's a kid. Victor yelled, his voice cracking. She makes things up. Does she? Betty countered. Because it seems to me she's the only honest person in this whole zip code. Now, I'm going to give you one chance, Victor. Just one. You tell me what is inside my husband's coffin right now. Victor stayed silent. He crossed his arms, trying to look tough, but his chin was trembling. It's against regulations to discuss client specifics. Betty pulled her cell phone out of her pocket. She held it up, her thumb hovering over the screen. Fine. Let's follow regulations, Betty said. I have the county sheriff's number right here. I'm going to call them. I'm going to tell them I have evidence of fraud, and I want an immediate exhumation order. We can get a backhoe out here tonight. We can dig it up. And if we open that lid and find my husband, I'll go to jail for disturbing the peace. She took a step closer, her eyes locking onto his. But if we open that lid, Victor, and we find nothing, then you go to jail. For desecration of a grave. For conspiracy. For fraud. And you know what happens to Emily then? She goes into foster care. Victor flinched as if she had slapped him. The mention of his daughter broke him. The tough guy act evaporated instantly. He slumped against the workbench, covering his face with his greasy hands. Don't, he whispered into his palms. Please don't call the cops. They'll kill me. Who will kill you? Betty asked, not lowering the phone. The men, Victor said, his voice muffled. The men who came with him. Betty felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. With him? With Joe. Victor looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed and terrified. He nodded slowly. He wasn't alone, Victor said. It was a year ago. Late. Maybe midnight. I was working late fixing the mower. A black SUV pulled up to the back gate. I thought it was kids trying to vandalize the place. So I went out there with a flashlight. Betty waited, her breath held in her throat. It was two guys in suits, Victor continued, speaking quickly now, the words spilling out like vomit. Big guys. Scary. And your husband, Joe. Betty felt the world tilt. You saw him? He was alive. He was standing right there, Victor said. He looked fine. Nervous, but fine. He wasn't burned. He wasn't hurt. He was holding a briefcase. Betty grabbed the edge of the workbench to steady herself. Joe had stood on this very ground, alive and well, while she was at home sobbing into his pillow. They told me they had a problem, Victor said. They said they needed a burial, but they didn't have a body. They said the paperwork was already taken care of. Some doctor they paid off, some funeral director who looked the other way. All they needed was the hole. And you helped them? Betty whispered. They gave me $10,000, Mrs. Poole. Victor pleaded. Cash. In a bag. I had credit card bills. My truck was broken down. Emily needed braces. It was right there. What is in the coffin, Victor? Betty demanded. What did I bury? Victor looked down at his boots, shame radiating off him in waves. Sandbags, he said softly, and bricks from the construction site down the road. We filled the casket to make it heavy, so the pallbearers wouldn't know. We screwed the lid shut tight. We lowered it down, covered it up, and they drove away. Betty felt a laugh bubbling up in her throat, a hysterical, manic laugh. Bricks. She had spent a year bringing flowers to a pile of bricks. She had talked to a pile of construction waste. She had cried her eyes out over sandbags. So he just left. Betty asked. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with a profound, aching shock. He watched you bury an empty box and just drove away? He didn't even look back, Victor said. One of the men in the suits clapped him on the shoulder and said, You're a free man now, Joe. And they got in the SUV and left. You're a free man now. The words cut Betty deeper than any knife. Joe had looked at his life with her, their home, their 45 years of history, and he had seen it as a prison. He had staged his own death to escape her, to escape the debt he created. He hadn't died for her. He hadn't sacrificed himself to save the house. He had saved himself. He had cashed in his life insurance policy like a lottery ticket and left her to deal with the wreckage. Where did he go? Betty asked. Her voice was quiet now, deadly calm. Victor shook his head. I don't know. I swear. They didn't say. Think, Victor, Betty commanded. You said they drove away. Did you hear anything? Did you see anything in the car? Anything at all? Victor squeezed his eyes shut, trying to remember. The car, it had out-of-state plates. I didn't catch the state. But wait. What? When the guy opened the briefcase to pay me, Victor said, his eyes opening, I saw a brochure tucked in the side pocket. It was bright blue, had a picture of a parrot on it. A parrot? Yeah, and Spanish words. Pura vida, or something like that. Betty's mind raced. Pura vida, pure life. That was the slogan for Costa Rica. Joe had talked about Costa Rica years ago. He had said it was a paradise where your money went further. He had said it was a good place to retire if you didn't want to be found. She looked at Victor. He was a broken man, terrified and small. He wasn't the villain here. He was just a desperate fool, just like she had been. You're going to help me, Victor, Betty said. I told you everything. Victor cried. Please just go. Leave me out of it. No, Betty said. You're not out of it. You're the only witness I have. You're going to tell me exactly what those men looked like. You're going to write down everything you remember about that car. And if you try to run, if you try to take Emily and disappear, I will make that phone call to the sheriff before you get to the highway. Victor nodded frantically. Okay, I'll do whatever you want. Betty turned and looked out the bay door. Darkness had fallen completely now. The cemetery was black and silent. Somewhere out there, thousands of miles away, Joe was probably sitting on a beach, drinking a cocktail paid for with the tears she had shed for him. He thought he was safe. He thought she was just a grieving old widow who would never ask questions. He thought she was stupid. Betty Poole tightened her grip on her purse. She wasn't stupid, and she wasn't grieving anymore. Bricks, she muttered to herself as she walked back to her car. She started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness. She knew where she had to go next. There was one other person who would know about Costa Rica. One other person who had been thick as thieves with Joe. His business partner, Jack. If Joe was the architect of this nightmare, Jack was the builder. And Betty was about to bring the whole house down. Betty didn't go home. Home was a place for people who had nothing left to do but sleep, and Betty Poole was wide awake. She felt a strange vibration in her hands, a mix of adrenaline and fury that she hadn't felt since she was a young mother catching her son in a lie. But this wasn't a stolen cookie or a broken vase. This was her life. She steered her sedan toward the downtown business district. It was nearly 8 p.m. Most of the office buildings were dark, their glass facades reflecting the street lights like black mirrors. But Betty knew where she was going. She was heading to the Thompson and Poole heavy machinery office. Joe and Jack Thompson had started the business 30 years ago. Jack was the talker, the salesman with the bright white teeth and the firm handshake. Joe was the logistics man, the one who made sure the diggers and cranes got to the construction sites on time. They were partners. They were friends. Jack had given the toast at their 40th anniversary party, raising a glass of champagne and calling Joe the brother I never had. Betty gripped the steering wheel tighter. Some brother, she muttered. If Victor the groundskeeper had buried the box, Jack had to be the one who paid for it. Victor didn't have $10,000 to throw around. Victor drove a rusted truck. Jack drove a Mercedes. It all fit. The gambling debts, the secrecy, the sudden accident. Joe couldn't have pulled this off alone. He needed someone on the outside to handle the money, to smooth over the paperwork, to make sure the widow stayed quiet and cashed the check. She pulled into the parking lot of the small brick office building. Just as she suspected, there was one car parked near the front entrance, Jack's silver Mercedes. And there was a light on in the corner office. Betty didn't park in a visitor spot. She pulled her car right up to the front door, blocking the ramp. She turned off the ignition and sat there for a moment in the silence. She looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She saw a 68-year-old woman with messy hair, dark circles under her eyes, and a coat that was too thin for the November chill. She looked frail. Good, she thought. Let him think I'm frail. She got out of the car and walked to the glass doors. They were locked, of course. She pressed the buzzer for the night line. She held it down, a long, annoying buzz that she knew would ring right at Jack's desk. She waited. 10 seconds. 20. Then a voice came over the intercom. It was impatient. We're closed. Call back in the morning. Open the door, Jack, Betty said. She spoke right into the speaker box. There was a long pause. The static hissed. Betty. Jack's voice changed instantly. It went from annoyed to sickly sweet. Betty, is that you? It's late. Is everything okay? Open the door, she repeated. The buzzer clicked, and the lock released. Betty pushed the heavy glass door open and walked into the lobby. It smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. She didn't stop at the reception desk. She walked straight down the hallway toward the light at the end. As she got closer, she heard a sound. Whir, crunch, whir. It was a mechanical, grinding noise. A paper shredder. Betty walked into the office without knocking. Jack Thompson was standing by the window, feeding a thick stack of documents into a large industrial shredder. He jumped when she entered, nearly dropping the papers. He was wearing his expensive suit, but his tie was loosened, and his sleeves were rolled up. He looked tired. He looked guilty. Betty! Jack turned off the machine quickly. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. He put on a smile that didn't reach his eyes. My goodness, you scared the life out of me. What are you doing here at this hour? You should be at home resting. Betty stood in the doorway, clutching her purse. She looked at the shredder. The bin was full of white confetti. Cleaning up, Jack? She asked. Jack laughed. A nervous, hollow sound. Just end-of-year housekeeping. You know how it is. Too much paper in this world. But tell me, what brings you here? Did something happen with the house? Do you need help with the insurance forms? He walked around his desk, approaching her with his arms open like he was going to hug her. He was playing the role of the concerned uncle perfectly. You look exhausted, Betty. He cooed. You're pale. Here, sit down. Let me get you some water. Grief does terrible things to the mind. You know, it messes with your sleep schedule. Don't touch me, Betty said. Jack stopped. His smile faltered. Betty, I don't want water, and I don't want to sit in your chair, Betty said, her voice trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of holding back her rage. I want to know where he is. Jack blinked. He took a slow step back, leaning his hip against his mahogany desk. Where who is? Betty, are you feeling all right? Did you take your medication today? Stop it, Betty snapped. Stop treating me like I'm senile. I'm not confused, Jack. I'm clearer than I've been in a year. She reached into her purse and pulled out the receipt. She didn't hand it to him. She held it up. Gas, she said. Water. Gum. Purchased 2 hours after you told the police my husband was dead. Jack squinted at the paper, but he waved his hand dismissively. Betty, honestly, it's a mistake. A computer glitch. Or maybe someone stole his wallet from the crash site. You're torturing yourself with this. I went to the cemetery, Jack. Betty said. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jack's face went still. I spoke to Victor, she continued. And I spoke to his daughter. You know what she told me? She told me the box is empty. Jack let out a sigh. He shook his head, looking at the floor with exaggerated pity. Oh, Betty, this is sad. Really sad. You're listening to the groundskeeper's kid. She's 7 years old. She has an active imagination. And Victor, well, Victor isn't exactly the most reliable witness, is he? He drinks. He probably told you a story to get a tip. He told me about the bricks. Betty said. Jack froze. He told me about the sandbags, Betty went on, her voice rising. He told me about the 2 men in suits. And he told me about the $10,000 cash someone paid him to look the other way while they buried a pile of construction waste. She took a step forward. Joe isn't in that ground, Jack. Joe is alive. He ran away because of the gambling debts. He ran away because he owes $500,000 to people who break kneecaps. And you helped him. Jack didn't say anything. He just stared at her. The friendly mask was slipping. His eyes were cold, calculating. I know about Costa Rica, Betty said, throwing her last card on the table. Pura vida, Jack. Isn't that what you guys used to joke about? Living the pure life. Jack looked at the shredder, then back at Betty. He walked slowly around his desk. He didn't look scared. He looked annoyed. You're imagining things, Betty, he said, his voice flat. You're a grieving widow who is having a breakdown. That's what the police will say. That's what the doctor will say. Let's find out, Betty said. She pulled her phone out. I'm going to call the police right now. I'm going to tell them to bring a shovel to this cemetery. And when they open that lid, Jack, you're going to prison for fraud, conspiracy, aiding and abetting. You'll lose your business. You'll lose everything. She started to dial 911. Jack moved faster than she expected. He crossed the room in 3 long strides. He didn't grab the phone. He didn't hit her. He walked past her and slammed the office door shut. Click. He twisted the heavy deadbolt lock. Betty spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. She backed away until she hit the shredder. Open that door. Jack turned to face her. He wasn't smiling anymore. He wasn't the nice family friend. He was a man who had been cornered, and he was much bigger than her. Put the phone away, Betty, Jack said softly. I'm calling them, Betty said, though her finger hovered over the call button, shaking. No, you're not, Jack said, because you don't know the whole story. You think you do, but you have no idea what you're actually dealing with. He walked over to the leather sofa in the corner and sat down, casually crossing his legs. He gestured to the chair opposite him. Sit down, Betty, he commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. I'm not sitting, she said defiantly. Sit down. Jack roared, slamming his hand on the armrest. Betty jumped. She took a shallow breath and slowly lowered herself into the chair. She kept her grip tight on her phone. You think Joe just ran away because he was scared? Jack asked, his voice dropping back to a conversational tone. You think he left you because he didn't love you? You're wrong. Joe didn't fake his death to save his own skin, Betty. He did it to save yours. Betty stared at him. What are you talking about? The people Joe owed money to, they aren't banks, Jack said. They don't send foreclosure notices. They send people to your house at night. They burn things down. They hurt people. Joe knew that if he stayed, they would come for the house. They would come for you to pay his debts. Jack leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. He died, so the life insurance would pay them off. Jack lied. He died, so you would get the house free and clear. He is living in a hut in the jungle, eating rice and beans, miserable and alone, just so you could sleep in your own bed safely. He left me, Betty whispered. He lied to me. He sacrificed himself for you. Jack corrected. And I helped him. Because that's what friends do. I risked my neck to save you. Betty. He stood up and walked back to his desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He tossed it onto the coffee table in front of her. It landed with a heavy thud. You want to go to the police? Jack asked. Go ahead. Call them. Tell them Joe is alive. You know what happens then? Betty looked at the envelope. What? The insurance company takes the money back, Jack said. They sue you for the $500,000 you spent. They take the house. They take your car. You'll be homeless within a month. And Joe? The police will find him, bring him back, and put him in prison for 20 years for insurance fraud. And the loan sharks? Once they know he's alive, they'll be waiting for him in his cell. Jack smirked. It was a cruel, triumphant look. So go ahead, Betty. Make the call. Destroy your life. Destroy Joe. Or, he pointed at the envelope. Or you can open that. And we can finish this business right now. Betty looked at the locked door. She looked at the phone in her hand. And then she looked at the heavy envelope on the table. She realized with a sickening jolt that Jack wasn't afraid of the police. He had been waiting for this. He had a plan. And she was walking right into the trap he had set. What's in the envelope? Betty asked. A choice, Jack said. Open it. Betty stared at the manila envelope on the coffee table. It sat there like a loaded gun. The room was deadly silent, the only sound being the faint hum of the air conditioning unit in the ceiling. Open it, Jack repeated, his voice calm, almost gentle now. It's not a bomb, Betty. It's your future. Betty reached out with a trembling hand. Her fingers felt cold. She undid the metal clasp and tipped the envelope upside down. Two things slid out onto the glass table. The first was a stack of cash. Wrapped in a rubber band, it was a thick brick of $100 bills. The second was a cheap black flip phone. A burner. Betty looked up at Jack, confusion warring with the anger in her chest. What is this? That, Jack said, pointing to the cash, is $50,000. It's the last of the liquidity we could squeeze out of the business before the end. Joe wanted you to have it. A safety net. And the phone. That's a direct line, Jack said. He leaned back in his leather chair, watching her carefully. Joe is on the other end. He's waiting for your call. He wants to explain everything himself. Betty looked at the black plastic phone. Her husband was on the other end. The husband she had mourned for 365 days. The husband she had whispered to in the dark. He wasn't in heaven. He was on a prepaid network, probably holding a phone, just like this one, waiting for her. He's in Costa Rica, Jack said softly. But he's not on vacation, Betty. That's what you need to understand. Jack leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his face serious. He looked like he was trying to explain a difficult math problem to a child. Joe isn't drinking margaritas on a beach, Jack said. He is living in a one-room shack with a tin roof. He has no hot water. He eats rice and beans. He works as a laborer on a coffee farm for $5 a day under a fake name. He gave up his golf clubs, his car, his Sunday roasts, and his friends. He gave up you. Why? Betty whispered. Why would he do that? To save you, Jack said with conviction. We were in deep, Betty, deeper than you can imagine. The gambling, it got out of hand. The people Joe owed money to, they aren't the kind of people you negotiate with. They were going to take the house. They were going to empty your retirement accounts. They were threatening to come to your door. Jack paused, letting the fear settle in the room. Joe had two choices, Jack continued. He could stay and watch you lose everything, watch you get thrown out on the street at 68 years old. Or he could die. If he died, the life insurance paid out. $500,000. Enough to clear the mortgage. Enough to keep you safe. Enough to make sure you never had to work a day in your life. Betty felt the room spin. He committed fraud to pay off his own mistakes. He sacrificed his life. Jack shot back, his voice rising. He chose to erase himself, so you could live comfortably. Do you have any idea how hard that was for him? To watch his own funeral from a distance? To leave the woman he loved, knowing he could never see her again? Jack pointed at the money on the table. He sent that cash for you. He's been saving every penny he makes down there. He sleeps on a dirt floor, Betty, just so he could send this back to you. That is love. It's messy and it's illegal, but it is love. Betty looked at the money, $50,000. Combined with the insurance money she still had in the bank, she was secure. She could live out her days in her paid-off house. She could travel. She could be safe. So here's your choice, Jack said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Option 1, you pick up that phone. You say hello to your husband. You tell him you love him. You take the cash, you walk out that door, and you go home. You keep the house. You keep your life. Joe stays dead, and he stays safe in the jungle. Jack paused. Or, option 2. He gestured toward Betty's smartphone, which she was still clutching in her right hand. You call the police. You tell them everything. And let me tell you exactly what happens the second you make that call. Jack started counting off on his fingers. 1. The insurance company launches an investigation immediately. They will freeze your bank accounts by tomorrow morning. They will sue you for the return of the $500,000. Since you spent some of it on the roof and the taxes, you won't have enough to pay them back. They will seize your house. They will take your car. They will take your furniture. 2. Jack continued, a cruel edge entering his voice. You become a co-conspirator. You knew about the money. You accepted the payout. You might not go to jail, but you will be bankrupt. You will be homeless. Betty, where will you go? Your sister's couch? A state-run nursing home? You're 68. Do you really want to start over with nothing? And 3, Jack finished leaning back. Joe goes to prison. They will extradite him. He will spend the last 10 or 15 years of his life in a cell. He won't survive it. He has a bad heart. You know that. Calling the police is a death sentence for him. The silence in the office was heavy, suffocating. Betty looked at the burner phone. She could just pick it up. She could hear his voice. She could say, I forgive you. She could take the money and walk away. Who would it hurt? The insurance company. They were a billion-dollar corporation. They wouldn't miss the money. Who would know? Only her, Jack, and Victor. And Victor was too scared to talk. It was the perfect out. It was mercy. Joe had messed up, yes. He had lied, yes. But he had done it to protect her financial future. Wasn't that what a husband was supposed to do? Provide? She imagined herself going home tonight. She would put the cash in the safe. She would sleep in her own bed. She would wake up tomorrow and make coffee in her own kitchen. She would be safe. But then she thought of the cemetery. She thought of the little girl, Emily, standing on the grave. Nobody is sleeping in this box. She thought of Victor, shaking with fear, burying a box of bricks in the middle of the night because 2 men in suits paid him off. She thought of the lie. It wasn't just a lie on a piece of paper. It was a lie that had stolen a year of her life. She had grieved for a ghost. She had cried real tears for a fraud. Joe hadn't just cheated the insurance company. He had cheated her. He had made her a widow while he was still alive. And now Jack was asking her to become part of the lie. He was asking her to sell her integrity for $50,000 and a paid-off mortgage. Betty looked at Jack. He was smiling, faintly confident. He thought he had won. He thought every woman had a price, and that the fear of being poor was stronger than the need for truth. He's waiting, Betty. Jack urged, just pick up the phone. Betty reached out. Her hand hovered over the black burner phone. She touched the plastic casing. Then She pulled her hand back. She looked at the stack of cash. It looked dirty to her. It looked like bribe money. You said he's living in a shack. Betty asked quietly. Yes, Jack nodded. Suffering for you. Good, Betty said. Jack's smile vanished. Excuse me? He's suffering because he's a coward, Jack. Not because he's a martyr. A man who loves his wife doesn't let her bury a box of bricks. A man who loves his wife stands by her side when the trouble comes, and he faces it with her. He doesn't run away to the jungle and leave her to unknowingly commit a felony. Betty stood up. Her legs were shaking, but her voice was clear. I lived 45 years with that man. We promised for richer or for poorer. I meant it. Apparently, he didn't. Betty, don't be an idiot. Jack hissed, standing up too. Think about the house. You'll be on the street. I'd rather sleep on a park bench with a clear conscience than in a king-sized bed paid for with lies, Betty said. She lifted her own smartphone. She didn't hesitate this time. She pressed the call button. Betty, put the phone down. Jack yelled, coming around the desk. Betty hit the speakerphone button and held it up like a shield. Beep, beep, beep. 911, what is your emergency? The operator's voice filled the room, loud and authoritative. Jack froze. He looked at the phone, then at Betty, his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He realized, too late, that he had underestimated her. He thought she was a weak old lady who wanted comfort. He didn't realize she was a woman who valued the truth more than her own life. My name is Betty Poole, Betty said, staring straight into Jack's eyes. I am at the offices of Thompson and Poole Construction. I need to report a massive insurance fraud. Betty, stop. Jack screamed. You're ruining everything. My husband, Joseph Poole, is not dead, Betty said into the phone, her voice never wavering. He is alive. He is in Costa Rica. And his business partner, Jack Thompson, is standing right here. He just offered me $50,000 to keep quiet. Ma'am, are you in immediate danger? The operator asked. I don't know, Betty said. Are you going to hurt me, Jack? Jack looked at the door, then at Betty. He looked at the shredder full of evidence. He looked at the cash on the table. He slumped his shoulders. It was over. The call was recorded. There was no going back. No, Jack spat, sinking back into his chair. I'm not going to hurt you. You just hurt yourself enough for both of us. Please send the police, Betty said to the operator. And tell the insurance investigators to come too. I have the money. I have the burner phone. And I have the location. She hung up the phone. The room was silent again. The offer was gone. The house was gone. The money was gone. Betty looked at the burner phone on the table. She picked it up. She didn't dial. She just walked over to the trash can by the door and dropped it in. You tell Joe, Betty said to Jack, who was now staring blankly at the wall, that he can keep his pura vida. I'm getting my life back. The real one. She unlocked the office door. She didn't run out. She walked out, head high into the cool night air to wait for the sirens. She knew she had just set a match to her entire existence. She knew tomorrow would be a nightmare of lawyers and evictions. But for the first time in a year, the heavy weight on her chest was gone. She was poor. She was alone. She was going to lose her home. But she was right, and that had to be enough. Betty just gave up her home and her fortune to turn her husband in. Was this the right choice? Or should she have taken the money and protected her family? Tell us in the comments. The sirens didn't sound like they do on television. They were louder, a chaotic wail that filled the small parking lot and bounced off the brick walls of the office building. Betty stood by the front door, her coat pulled tight around her, watching the flashing blue lights wash over the asphalt. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She felt a strange, heavy stillness, like the air before a thunderstorm breaks. 2 police cruisers pulled up to the curb. Officers stepped out, hands resting near their belts, assessing the situation. Betty waved them over. She felt incredibly calm. She led them into the office where Jack Thompson was still sitting in his leather chair, staring at the shredder. He didn't fight. When the officers told him to stand up and put his hands behind his back, he just sighed. It was the sigh of a man who had been carrying a heavy weight for too long and was finally putting it down. As they walked him past Betty, the handcuffs clicking softly, Jack stopped for a second. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked tired. "You know you just burned your own house down, right?" Jack asked quietly. "At least it was my choice," Betty replied. She watched them put him in the back of the cruiser. She gave her statement to a young female officer who took notes on a tablet. Betty handed over the evidence, the gas station receipt, the bank statements, the threats from the loan sharks she had taken from the storage unit. She told them everything. She told them about the empty grave. She told them about Costa Rica. She told them about the bribe. When she finally drove home that night, it was 3 a.m. She walked into her silent house, the house she had fought so hard to keep, and she knew it wasn't hers anymore. The next 3 months were a blur of lawyers, insurance adjusters, and cold, hard reality. Jack was right about the fallout. The insurance company was a machine. They didn't care that Betty was a victim. They didn't care that she had been lied to. They cared about the math. The life insurance payout of $500,000 had been fraudulent. Since Betty had used that money to pay off the mortgage, the house was now considered an asset acquired with stolen funds. "We have to liquidate to recover the loss," the insurance adjuster told her. He was a nice man with a soft voice, but his words were iron. Betty signed the papers. She didn't fight them. She couldn't keep a house built on a crime. The for sale sign went up in the yard the next week. Then came the hardest part, the packing. How do you pack up 45 years of a life? Betty moved from room to room with cardboard boxes. She packed the china she and Joe had received as a wedding gift. She packed the photo albums. She packed the winter coats. But she left a lot behind. She held a yard sale on a Saturday morning. She watched strangers haggle over her dining room table. She watched a young couple buy Joe's tools, the same tools he had used to fix the back deck. It should have been heartbreaking. She expected to be devastated, but as she watched her possessions disappear into the trunks of other people's cars, she felt lighter. Each item sold was a tether cut. She was shedding the skin of Mrs. Joseph Poole, the wealthy widow with the perfect life. She was becoming just Betty. The house sold quickly. The money went to the insurance company. The bank accounts were drained to pay the legal fees and the restitution. When the dust settled, Betty had enough money for a security deposit and a few months of rent. She moved into an apartment complex on the other side of town. It wasn't in the nice neighborhood. It was a square brick building near the bus line. Her apartment was on the second floor, number 2B. It had one bedroom, a kitchenette with a stove that tilted slightly to the left, and a living room that could barely fit her sofa. The carpet was a faded beige, and the faucet dripped if she didn't turn it tight enough. It was a far cry from the 4-bedroom colonial with the manicured lawn. But the first night she slept there, she slept for 10 hours straight. She didn't dream of fires or ravines. She didn't wake up wondering if someone was going to knock on the door to collect a debt. The door was locked. The rent was paid. The silence was honest. A month later, a letter arrived in her mailbox. It was a plain white envelope. The return address was stamped in red ink, State Correctional Facility. The handwriting was familiar. It was jagged and rushed. Joe. He had been extradited 2 weeks ago. The news had been a small blip in the local paper. Local businessman found alive in insurance scheme. He was awaiting trial, but with Jack's testimony and the paper trail, A plea deal was likely. He would be in prison for a long time. Betty took the letter upstairs. She sat at her small laminate kitchen table and stared at it. She ran her thumb over the envelope. She could feel the folded paper inside. What did he have to say? Was it an apology? Was it a list of excuses? Did he want to tell her that he loved her, that he did it all for her? Or did he want to blame her for ruining his escape? For a moment, the old Betty, the wife who smoothed things over, the woman who wanted to believe the best, wanted to open it. She wanted to hear his voice one last time. But then she remembered the empty grave. She remembered the year of grief she had wasted. She remembered the little girl, Emily, who had been forced to keep a secret no child should carry. Joe had made his choices. He had chosen money over marriage. He had chosen fear over loyalty. Betty stood up and walked to the kitchen sink. She took a box of matches from the drawer. She struck a match, the smell of sulfur filling the small room. She held the flame to the corner of the envelope. The paper curled and blackened. The fire caught, turning the white envelope into orange flame. Betty dropped it into the stainless steel sink and watched it burn. She watched the red stamp of the prison turn to ash. She watched Joe's handwriting disappear. She didn't need to read it. She knew everything she needed to know. When the fire was out, she turned on the tap and washed the ashes down the drain. Betty grabbed her coat and walked out of the apartment. It was late afternoon, her favorite time of day. She walked 2 blocks to a small public park. It wasn't as grand as the country club she used to belong to, but it had a nice bench overlooking a pond where ducks paddled in circles. She sat down. The air was crisp. A young mother was pushing a stroller nearby. An old man was throwing crumbs to the birds. Betty took a deep breath. The air felt different here. It felt clean. She looked at her hands. They were older now, spotted with age, ringless. She had sold the diamond. She didn't need it. She thought about where she would be if she had taken Jack's offer. She would still be in the big house. She would have $50,000 in the safe. She would be comfortable. But she would be looking over her shoulder every single day. She would be a prisoner in her own home, guarding a lie. Now she had nothing. Her bank account hovered near zero. She clipped coupons for the grocery store. She took the bus because she sold the car to pay the last of the legal bills. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Betty Poole smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that reached her eyes. She wasn't a widow. She wasn't a victim. She was a survivor. She had looked the devil in the face and told him the truth. She leaned back against the wooden bench, watching the last sliver of light disappear behind the trees. I lost a fortune, she whispered to the wind, but I found myself. What city are you listening from? And what time is it there? Write it in the comments. And if you'd like to help me keep sharing these emotional, thrilling stories every day, even a small donation makes a big difference. It truly helps keep the channel alive. For more life stories like this, you can explore the other videos on my channel and subscribe. On the screen, you'll see 2 new stories I'm sure you'll enjoy. Click one and start listening right away. With love,